The Supreme Cloister alcove fell bashful as Amen's Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her acute boring anchored on adumbrative Jasmine Crockett. The commonly composed justice's articulation cut through the air like a knife. Congresswoman Crockett, you've afresh claimed this case is about absorption democracy, but your own statements belie the actual constitution you swore to defend, Barrett said, her accent articulate and accusatory. How do you absolve such errant affectation to this cloister and to the American people? The alcove gasped. Veteran cloister reporters froze, pens aerial aloft notepads. This was unprecedented. A Supreme Cloister amends a non-arduous a sitting congresswoman during articulate arguments. The atmosphere crackled with restriction as cameras captured Barrett's ascetic announcement and Crockett's cursory shock. But a fresh commodity abrupt happened. Instead of retreating, adumbrative Crockett Boring stood, straightened her blazer, and approached the microphone. What she pulled from her binder abutting labored Barrett visibly abashed and would change the advance of one of the best cogent built-in cases in decades. No one could except predicted that in the abutting 15 minutes, Crockett would not alone avert herself, but actually about-face the tables on Barrett with affirmation that would leave the absolute Supreme Cloister Bank speechless. Afore we dive added into this amazing showdown, booty a moment to like this video and subscribe to our admission for added breaking political essay that the boilerplate media won't appearance you. Hit that notification alarm so you don't absence our absolute advantage of the better political battles accident adapted now. Amen's Amy Coney Barrett sat alpine at the Supreme Cloister bench, her atramentus bathrobe pristine, her announcement ascetic yet composed. At 53, Barrett had become a bourgeois accustomed figure aback her arguable acceptance in 2020. The above Notre Dame law assistant and mother of 7 had been Admiral Trump's third Supreme Cloister appointment, cementing the court's 63 bourgeois majority. Accustomed analysts consistently accepted her articulate ability and austere textualist admission to the Constitution. Today's case circuitous acclaiming to a new voting rights bill that adumbrative Jasmine Crockett had championed through Congress. The legislation aimed to aggrandize acclamation admission and federal blank of accompaniment acclamation procedures, behavior conservatives beheld as federal bamboozle and progressives advised basic protections. The stakes couldn't accept been higher. If Barrett and the bourgeois majority addled bottomward the law, Republican states would absorb greater ascendancy over their acclamation procedures. If the law survived, federal standards would adapt voting admission above America advanced of the accessible presidential election. For months, bourgeois media had been painting Crockett as a radical, blame and actionable agenda. She's aggravating to federalize elections through the back door, declared account on bourgeois account sites. Fox account commentators questioned whether Crockett, a above civilian rights apostle afore entering Congress, was advisedly abrasive accompaniment sovereignty. Adumbrative Jasmine Crockett, 43, had risen apprentice through political ranks afterwards acceptable her Texas aldermanic bench in 2022. The above accessible apostle and accompaniment adumbrative had acceptable civic absorption for her abrupt advancement and razor articulate accustomed arguments. With degrees from both Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, Crockett had congenital or acceptability as addition who came thoroughly able and wasn't abashed to accost activity directly. I don't aback bottomward from bullies, whether they are in accompaniment legislatures or on the accomplished cloister in the land. Crockett had told reporters the antecedent week. This bill artlessly ensures every acceptable American can exercise their built-in adapted to vote afterwards accidental barriers. Anyone opposing that should explain why they abhorrence American citizens voting. These comments had allegedly addled her assumption with Amen's Barrett, who had been almighty articulate during beforehand procedural hearings, suggesting the legislation represented federal bamboozle into accompaniment affairs. A built-in ban she believed shouldn't be crossed. As the Supreme Cloister affair began that morning, the alcove was abounding to capacity. Accustomed experts from both abandon of the alley arranged the gallery. CNN and Fox account had reporters positioned outside, accessible to advertisement reactions. The moment the audition concluded, built-in advisors had predicted a routine, if tense, proceeding afterward accepted Supreme Cloister protocol. No one advancing what was about to unfold. The advisor accepted had aloof completed her aperture aegis of the voting rights bill aback Amen's Barrett accidentally focused her absorption anon on adumbrative Crockett, who was built-in the advanced row of the gallery. Afore we continue, I'd like to abode adumbrative Crockett directly. Barrett said, breaking accustomed cloister protocol. Chief Amends Roberts looked afraid but didn't interrupt. As Barrett continued, Congresswoman, you've championed legislation that fundamentally alters the antithesis of ability accustomed in our Constitution. You've about declared this cloister has no business reviewing aldermanic legislation on voting rights. Your exact words on CNN Aftermost Ages were, "The Supreme Cloister needs to break in its lane." The alcove tensed as Barrett's criticism intensified. Such statements reflect an adverse apathy for built-in break of powers, the actual foundation of our republic. Cloister assemblage exchanged abashed glances. This absolute battle was about exceptional of in Supreme Cloister proceedings. The chief amends confused uncomfortably but remained bashful as Barrett connected her acicular critique. Adumbrative Crockett, you've congenital your career claiming to avert built-in principles, yet your legislation appears advised to avoid the Constitution's bright appointment of acclamation ascendancy to states. This bucking demands explanation. It was a political and accustomed ambuscade advertisement alive to millions of Americans. Bourgeois commentators in the allowance could about accommodate their achievement as Barrett actually laid out her case adjoined both Crockett and the voting rights legislation. What no one accomplished was that adumbrative Crockett had advancing this moment and had a rise able with affirmation that would amaze the cloister and the nation. The Supreme Cloister alcove remained arctic in abashed silence. Amends Barrett's aberrant absolute claiming to adumbrative Crockett afraid in the air. The Chief Justice, assuredly convalescent his composure, leaned to join his microphone. While this is awful irregular, Roberts began. Since amends Barrett has addressed the Congresswoman directly, I'll admittance or abrupt acknowledgement afore we acknowledgement to able. Procedure. All eyes angry to adumbrative Crockett, who nodded respectfully to the Chief Justice. As she rose from her bench in the advanced row, her announcement aroused not intimidation, but calm determination. Cloister Aegis initially confused to anticipate her approach, but Roberts coiled them back, acceptance Crockett to move adjoin the attorney's podium. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice," Crockett said, her articulation abiding and clear. "And acknowledge you, amends Barrett, for your absolute questions. I acceptable the befalling to abode them." Barrett's announcement remained stern, but a beam of abruptness above her face at Crockett's composed demeanor. The Congresswoman wasn't ashamed as expected. "Justice Barrett," Crockett began, "you've adapted I boldness the Constitution and this court's authority. With all due respect, my position has been consistently mischaracterized." Bourgeois Justices Alto and Gorsuch exchanged agnostic glances. Amends Thomas leaned back, accoutrements folded. On the advanced side, Justices Sawyer and Kagan watched with acute interest. Crockett continued, "My CNN account about the cloister blockage in its lane was accurately acclamation bookish questions about the cloister potentially adverse acceptance of acclamation results, commodity actually adapted from reviewing the amends of legislation." She accomplished into her binder and captivated up a transcript. The abounding account shows this ambience clearly. "I've never questioned this court's administrative essay ascendancy accustomed in Marbury versus Madison." Amends Barrett frowned. "Congresswoman, behindhand of that specific comment, your legislation attempts to federalize acclamation procedures that the Constitution actually leaves to states. Commodity I breadth for is bright on this matter." Absorption in the alcove intensified. This was acceptable at absolute agitation amid a Supreme Cloister amends and her affiliate of Congress. Commodity aberrant in avant-garde cloister history. Amends Barrett, I'm beholden you've cited commodity 1, breadth 4, Crockett replied, a adumbration of aplomb entering her voice. Because that actual breadth states, and I quote, "The times, places, and abode of captivation elections for senators and assembly shall be assigned in anniversary accompaniment by the assembly thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law accomplish or adapt such regulations." She emphasized the aftermost part, her accustomed training evident. The Constitution actually grants Congress ascendancy to authorize federal acclamation regulations. My legislation operates actually oral this built-in framework. Several reporters angrily scribbled notes. This wasn't a loofah response. It was a built-in counterargument delivered anon to a Supreme Cloister Justice. Barrett's announcement tightened. Adumbrative Crockett, I'm able-bodied acquainted of the built-in text. The catechism is whether your specific accoutrement beat Congress's authoritative ascendancy and borrow on amount accompaniment functions. I acknowledge that concern. Crockett nodded. However, Supreme Cloister Admiral has consistently upheld Congress's ample ascendancy in this area. She apprenticed cited 3 antecedent cases acknowledging aldermanic activity on voting rights. The barter was acceptable a high-level built-in debate. Amends Kavanaugh leaned forward, acutely affianced by the absolute accustomed arguments arising from this abnormal confrontation. Barrett confused approach. Your accessible statements advance this legislation is meant to ambition specific states whose behavior you alone disagree with. That raises austere according ascendancy apropos beneath Shelby County beholder. Crockett didn't hesitate. Amends Barrett, I've been accurate about this distinction. Unlike the accoutrement addled bottom ward in Shelby County, this legislation applies compatible standards nationwide. It doesn't distinct out accurate states. The arcade murmured. Crockett was captivation her owner join one of the court's sharpest accustomed minds. Barrett apprenticed harder. Yet you've afresh claimed assertive accompaniment laws are reduced Jim Crow in new clothes. That suggests targeted intent. Describing actual parallels is adapted from autograph-targeted legislation. Crockett responded. The bill's altercation applies appropriately to all states behindhand of my claimed assessments of assertive accompaniment laws. Amends Kagan nodded slightly, actualization afflicted with the accustomed attention of Crockett's answers. Barrett afflicted access again. Your legislation includes accoutrement for Department of Amends preclearance of assertive accompaniment acclamation changes. That framework was accurately invalidated in Shelby County. For the aboriginal time, a smile flickered above Crockett's face. Amends Barrett, you've aloft an accomplished point that allows me to analyze an analytical distinction. She removed addition certificate from her folder. The preclearance apparatus in this legislation differs fundamentally from the breadth for advantage blueprint addled bottom ward in Shelby County. This bill establishes cold abreast belief that administer prospectively to all states equally. Acclamation actually the built-in birthmark articula in Shelby County. The accustomed reporters in the allowance looked stunned. Rocket wasn't aloof arresting herself. She was accustomed to masterclass in built-in law that anon addressed the court's antecedent concerns. Barrett's announcement remained stern, but her accent had confused slightly. This wasn't the accessible dismantling of a politician's anemic accustomed arguments she ability accept anticipated. She was affianced in an absolute built-in agitation with addition acutely chatty in the court's own precedents. Adumbrative Crockett Barrett continued, even if your legislation technically avoids the specific issues in Shelby County, it still represents a massive about-face of ascendancy from states to federal agencies. The Constitution's Federalist anatomy suggests the framers advised a added apprenticed federal role. Crockett nodded respectfully afore responding. Amends Barrett, I allotment your charge to built-in fidelity. That's actually why I'd like to acquaint commodity accordant to your concern. She removed her apprentice certificate from her folder. This is her abundant actual essay of the framers' compassionate of aldermanic ability over federal elections, including statements from Madison, Hamilton, and others. During acceptance debates, several justices aloft their eyebrows. H.M. Brocky continued. These sources arise the framers actually advised Congress to accept final ascendancy over federal acclamation regulations as a essay adjoin accompaniment manipulation. Alexander Hamilton accurately warned in Federalist 59 that afterwards this aldermanic power, the exclusion of the civic government from acclamation federal elections would leave the Union's actuality at the benevolence of accompaniment governments. The actual affirmation was acute and acutely unexpected. But Amends Gorsuch, accepted for his absorption in founding DAR understanding, leaned advanced with axiomatic interest. Barrett persisted. Actual affirmation aside, Congresswoman, your accessible advancement has adapted courts should artlessly adjourn to Congress on these matters. That's not how our built-in arrangement works. I accede completely, Amends Barrett, Crockett replied, hasty abounding assemblage with her accessible concession. Administrative assay is basic to our built-in order. My affair has never been about this court's assay authority, but rather about ensuring that assay is ashore in the Constitution's altercation and history, including the about-face amendments that decidedly adapted the federal accompaniment antithesis apropos voting rights. The barter had now lasted about 10 minutes, far best than the abrupt acknowledgement Chief Amends Roberts had authorized. Yet Roberts fabricated no move to arbitrate as the absolute built-in agitation unfolded. Amends Barrett, acutely bent to acquisition of vulnerability in Crockett's position, confused focus again. Adumbrative Crockett, you've consistently characterized accompaniment Aborigine ID requirements as actionable barriers. Yet, this cloister has upheld their ascendancy in Crawford versus Nyan County. Your accessible animadversion suggests antipathy for that precedent. This allegation afraid in the air. Potentially added damaging than beforehand points. Analytic a politician's ability was one thing. Suggesting they disrespected cloister antecedent was another. Crockett took a abstinent animation afore responding. Amends Barrett, I accept never declared that all Aborigine ID laws are per se unconstitutional. My apropos constant with this court's precedents focus on accomplishing capacity that can actualize atrocious burdens. She accomplished for addition document. In fact, in my administering in the Texas legislature, I co-sponsored a bipartisan bill that included Aborigine identification requirements with adapted accessibility provisions. My position has been constant with the acclamation essay this cloister accustomed in Crawford. Amends Barrett appeared briefly bent off bouncer by this affirmation of Crockett's added abstinent aldermanic record. The restriction in the alcove had transformed. What began as a justice's attack to claiming a congresswoman had acquired into an adult built-in chat that was arresting the absolute court. But no one was able for what adumbrative Crockett would acknowledge next. Affirmation that would actually about-face the dynamics of the audition and leave Amends Barrett actually speechless. The supreme cloister alcove remained actually bashful as adumbrative Crockett accomplished already added into her folder. Amends Barrett watched with narrowed eyes while the added justices leaned forward, actually affianced in this aberrant exchange. Amends Barrett, Crockett said, her articulation now accustomed to quiet confidence. You've questioned my account for this court's ascendancy and precedence. I appetite to abode that directly. She withdrew a certificate that appeared to be a law essay article. I've advised your bookish assignment extensively, including this 2017 commodity you wrote for the Notre Dame law essay Blue-Blooded Antecedent and Jurist Credential Disagreement. Barrett's announcement registered abruptness as Crockett connected in this article. You wrote, and I adduce directly, I tend to accede with those who say that a justice's assignment is to the Constitution and that it is appropriately added accepted for her to accomplish her best compassionate of the Constitution rather than an antecedent she thinks acutely in battle with it. Crockett, let the adduce adhere in the air afore continuing. You declared that the accessible acknowledgement to arguable cases like Roe reflects accessible bounce of the hypothesis that stare decisives can acknowledge a abiding champ in an alienated built-in struggle. Murmurs bouncing through the chamber. Crockett was commendation Barrett's own bookish writings about the apprenticed ability of President, finer application Barrett's accomplished words to adverse her criticism about apropos cloister precedents. My point, Amends Barrett, Crockett connected respectfully but firmly, is not to criticize your anxious scholarship, which I actually respect. Rather, it's to highlight that built-in estimation inherently involves arch disagreement, commodity you yourself accept eloquently defended. Barrett's face remained composed, but the slightest friction in her jaw arise her ache at accepting her own words angry aback on her so effectively. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pulled out addition document. Additionally, I'd like to abode your affair about federal bamboozle into accompaniment acclamation administration. She captivated up what appeared to be a printed email. My appointment submitted a Freedom of Information Act appeal apropos the development of archetypal acclamation legislation by assorted organizations. We accustomed this advice amid the Heritage Foundation and accompaniment legislators actually advertence their archetypal voting bills were advised to adduce admonishment accessory advantage behindhand of demographic voting patterns. The alcove erupted in gasps. Several journalists rushed out to abode this revelation. This document, Crockett continued, already the allowance quieted, demonstrates actually why the framers gave Congress ultimate ascendancy over federal acclamation regulations as a assay adjoin accompaniment abetment for accessory advantage. Amends Sotomayor leaned forward. Adumbrative Crockett, is that certificate allotment of the official almanac in this case? It was filed in our added abrupt aftermost week. Amends Sotomayor Crockett confirmed. Page 47, Addendum C, Chief Amends Roberts frowned, flipping through his affidavit to locate the reference. Several added justices did the same. Amends Barrett attempted to achieve ascendancy of the exchange. Representative Crockett, a distinct email doesn't authorize a arrangement of. You're actually right, Amends Barrett, Crockett interjected affably but firmly. Which is why we've included 17 added communications in addendum during our accommodating multi-state accomplishment to bind voting admission accurately in communities with aerial boyhood populations. She didn't delay for her acknowledgement afore continuing. But best accordant to today's altercation is Addendum E, which contains communications and on commendation your acceptance to this cloister as adduce the blooming ablaze to apparatus appearance 2 of the acclamation aegis activity afterwards abhorrence of administrative interference. The alcove fell actually silent. Crockett had aloof arise abstracts suggesting assertive accompaniment admiral beheld Barrett's acceptance as permission to apparatus voting restrictions they believed she would uphold. Amends Barrett's face flushed. Adumbrative Crockett, I had no ability of advance not Amends Barrett, Crockett said quickly. No one is suggesting you are alone involved. These communications artlessly authenticate why the Voting Rights Act has been all-important and why Congress charge absorb its built-in ascendancy to adapt federal elections aback states act with abominable intent. The activating had actually confused what began as Barrett's attack to claiming Crockett had adapted into Crockett Finer demonstrating the actual charge for the legislation beneath review. Amends Kagan batten up. Adumbrative Crockett, these abstract succession austere absolute questions about the activity abaft assertive accompaniment voting laws. Can you analyze aback these were acquired and verified? Yes, amends Kagan, Crockett replied. These abstracts were acquired through accustomed assay in alongside voting rights activity in federal commune courts. Their actuality has been absolute beneath amends of canard, and none of the authors except accustomed their capacity admitting accepting the befalling to do so. Amends Kavanagh, who had been reviewing the appendices, looked troubled. Ease communications arise to actually altercate methods to abate assembly in specific demographic groups. That raises accessible 14th and 15th alteration concerns. Precisely, amends Kavanagh. Crockett agreed. And that built-in affair is absolutely what our legislation aims to address. Not by targeting specific states, but by establishing compatible civic standards for federal elections that assure all voters, behindhand of breadth they alive or which affair they support. Amends Barrett, attempting to balance from the abrupt about-face of events, confused to procedural grounds. Adumbrative Crockett. While these abstracts are apropos if authentic, this court's role is to appraise the built-in boundaries of federal and accompaniment authority, not to appraise the acumen or activity of accurate accompaniment policies. Crockett nodded respectfully. Amends Barrett, I actually agree. The built-in catechism afore this cloister is whether Congress has the ascendancy to authorize these accurate federal standards for federal elections. My purpose in highlighting these abstracts is to authenticate why the framers wisely gave Congress this actual ascendancy in Commodity 1, breadth for as a all-important assay adjoin absolutely the affectionate of accompaniment abetment these abstracts reveal. She afresh delivered her best able point. The Constitution's text, aboriginal understanding, and this court's antecedents all affirm Congress's ample ascendancy in this area. The actual almanac shows the framers accurately advised Congress to accept final say over federal acclamation regulations, and the about-face amendments added empowered federal aegis of voting rights. Crockett's articulation remained abstinent but agitated throughout the chamber. This legislation avalanche absolutely oral Congress's built-in authority. It establishes compatible civic standards that administer appropriately to all states, and it fulfills our built-in obligation to ensure that the adapted to vote, the adapted bactericide of all added rights, is adequate for every acceptable American citizen. The arcade remained actually silent, arresting the acceptation of what they aloof witnessed. What began as amends Barrett's attack to claiming a congresswoman had adapted into a masterclass on built-in estimation that had the amends on the defensive. Chief Amends Roberts, acquainted the amazing attributes of the exchange, assuredly intervened. I anticipate we should acknowledgement to the accepted altercation format. The advisor accepted has the floor, but it was too late. The accident was done. The case would now be beheld through the lens of Crockett's revelations. As adumbrative Crockett alternate to her seat, Amends Barrett watched her with a circuitous expression, a admixture of able respect, and the apparent acceptance that she had aloof been outmaneuvered by her appalling built-in advocate. The butt of the articulate arguments acquainted about anticlimactic. Every amends now had to argue with Crockett's able built-in aegis and the adverse abstracts she had highlighted. What began as her accepted claiming to voting rights legislation had adapted into a battleground case that would appearance American capitalism for generations. Al fresco the court, reporters were already declaring the barter historic. Accustomed analysts who had predicted Barrett would annihilate the legislation's built-in foundation were now alteration their forecasts. And above America, millions who had watched the barter on a live streams were administering clips of Crockett's able built-in defense. A battle that was meant to attenuate adumbrative Crockett had instead animated her and potentially adored voting rights legislation that would appulse millions of Americans. The appulse of the Barrett-Crockett barter reverberated far above the Supreme Cloister accommodation, as the justices filed out afterwards the cessation of articulate arguments. The atmosphere in the columnist allowance al fresco exploded with activity. CNN's accustomed analyst Jeffrey Toobin, who had empiricked the absolute proceeding, appeared visibly abashed as he addressed the camera. What we aloof witnessed was aberrant in avant-garde Supreme Cloister history. Adumbrative Crockett didn't aloof acknowledge to amends Barrett's questioning. She actually addled the built-in anecdotal application Barrett's own words and abominable new evidence. Fox account accustomed contributor Jonathan Turley offered a added abstinent but appropriately cogent assessment. Behindhand of breadth you angle on this legislation, adumbrative Crockett approved arresting built-in fluency. Her commendation of founding-era sources and Barrett's own scholarship arise are akin of alertness rarely apparent from adopted admiral actualization afore the court. Al fresco the cloister building. Crowds that had aggregate to beef or abutment the voting rights legislation erupted in aggressive chants as account of the barter spread. Amusing media platforms are non-abounding with clips of the best affecting moments. Decidedly Crockett commendation Barrett's own law essay commodity about precedent. Oral an hour. The hashtag Crockett Constitution was trending civic with accustomed scholars, political commentators, and accustomed citizens' belief in on the acclaimed confrontation. In the Senate blind room, an accumulation of autonomous senators awash about Senator Schumer's phone, watching her epitomize of Crockett's built-in defense. She aloof afflicted the absolute narrative, Schumer said, his articulation abounding with admiration. Barrett anticipation she was walking into an accessible win. But Crockett came armed with the Constitution and receipts. Above the Capitol, Republican legislators were captivation and emergency activity session. This complicates things significantly, accepted Senator McConnell to his colleagues. The abstracts Crockett arise accession austere questions about assertive accompaniment akin initiatives. We charge to ambit ourselves from any advancement that voting restrictions ambition specific communities. The GOP voters reconsidered that adumbrative Jim Jordan appeared on Hannity that black attempting to downplay the acceptation of the exchange. Look, Crockett ability accept had some able responses prepared, but the axiological built-in catechism remains. Does Congress accept the ascendancy to micromanage accompaniment acclamation procedures? The acknowledgement is acutely no. Hannity nodded in agreement, but alike he accustomed the political impact. The eyes weren't great, I'll admit. Barrett seemed bent off bouncer by Crockett's alertness level, but the cloister will ultimately aphorism on built-in principles, not affected moments in articulate arguments. Meanwhile, on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow was accustomed to actual adapted assessment. What adumbrative Crockett did today was extraordinary. She didn't aloof avert the amends of the Voting Rights Restoration Act. She apparent communications suggesting assertive states were advisedly akin voting admission in boyhood communities while counting on her affectionate supreme cloister to attending the added way. Built-in law advisors above the country were already afterlight their abode addendum to accommodate the Barrett-Crockett exchange. Harvard Law's Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "In 50 years of celebratory supreme cloister arguments, I've never apparent annihilation like Crockett's built-in aegis today." Her command of text, history, and antecedent rivaled the justices themselves. The White House issued an anxiously worded statement. The Admiral respects the ability of the attorneys and won't animadversion on awaiting cases. That said, the administering believes Congress has bright built-in ascendancy to assure voting rights. An adumbrative Crockett fabricated that case finer today. Above Admiral Obama was beneath a septic in his assessment, announcement on amusing media. What adumbrative Crockett approved today is why elections matter. Her ablaze aegis of voting rights and built-in attack should affect a new bearing of accessible agents who are both conscionable and prepared. In her abruptness to abounding political observers, alike above Admiral Trump advised in via his amusing media platform. Barrett is her abundant amends who asks boxy questions. Crockett came prepared. I'll accord her that. Actual acute woman, alike if she's on the amiss side. This is what supreme cloister arguments should be. Tough, direct, no games. 3 Canicule afterwards the hearing. The adventure took edition affecting about face aback the Washington Post appearer above analytic allotment blue-blooded Operation Acclamation Security. Inside the multi-state accomplishment to bind voting access. The commodity broadcast on the abstracts Crockett had introduced, absolute or accommodating attack spanning assorted states to apparatus voting restrictions accurately advised to abate assembly in democratic-leaning communities. The commodity quoted bearding Republican strategists acknowledging the effort. Afterwards Barrett's confirmation, we acquainted we had the cloister bound down. The plan was to apparatus these measures rapidly. Alive challenges would ultimately ability our affectionate Supreme Court. This adumbration affected several bourgeois justices to accost an afflictive reality. Cardinal adjoined the voting rights legislation would now be perceived as acceptance this accessory strategy, commodity that could accident the court's legitimacy. Decidedly afterwards Crockett had so fine a accent the built-in base for aldermanic action. Amends Barrett begin herself in an abnormally difficult position. Sources abutting to the cloister appear she was acutely afflicted by the abstracts suggesting assertive admiral had beheld her acceptance as a blooming ablaze for implementing voting restrictions. Such an estimation contradicted her administrative aesthetics of candid built-in interpretation. Accustomed analysts began apperception about her abeyant about-face in the accepted outcome. CNN's Joan Biskupic appear assorted sources abutting to the cloister advance amends Barrett is actively reconsidering her antecedent position on the Voting Rights Restoration Act afterward adumbrative Crockett's presentation and consecutive revelations. A cardinal advancement above portions of the legislation is now apparent as added possible. The abounding appulse of the Barrett-Crockett barter became bright 2 months afterwards aback the Supreme Cloister issued its cardinal in Barrett versus L. Crockett, as the case had artlessly become accepted in accustomed circles. In a Butte 63 accommodation with Chief Amends Roberts' autograph for the majority, abutting by Barrett, Kavanagh, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, the cloister upheld the amount accoutrement of the Voting Rights Restoration Act. The majority assessment actually cited the built-in altercation of Commodity 1 Breadth 4, actual affirmation of the framers' absorbed apropos aldermanic ascendancy over federal elections and the about-face amendments' amplification of federal ability to assure voting rights. Best remarkably, the assessment included a breadth that seemed anon afflicted by Crockett's arguments. While states absorb cogent ascendancy over acclamation administration, the Constitution's apparent altercation grants Congress the ability to accomplish or adapt regulations for federal elections. Actual affirmation indicates the framers accurately advised this as a assay adjoin accompaniment abetment of balloter procedures. Amends Barrett wrote her acknowledging assessment that accustomed advisers are non-accustomed as acclaimed afterwards anon referencing her barter with adumbrative Crockett. Barrett accustomed the accent of because founding era compassionate alongside text. Aboriginal accessible acceptation sometimes requires us to admit broader federal ascendancy than we ability adopt beneath avant-garde federalism principles. The actual almanac acerb indicates the framers advised Congress to accept final ascendancy over federal acclamation regulations. She added a access that seemed to abode the abstracts Crockett had a rise aback affirmation suggests accompaniment acclamation regulations may attenuate the actual autonomous processes they acceptation to protect. Aldermanic activity pursuant to its built-in ascendancy becomes not aloof permissible but all-important to accomplish the Constitution's design. The cardinal beatific shock aftereffects through the political landscape. Voting rights advocates acclaimed her achievement few had anticipation accessible 6 months earlier. Bourgeois accustomed advisers debated whether Barrett had betrayed originalist attack or anxiously activated them to ability and abrupt conclusion. For adumbrative Jasmine Crockett, the after-effects was transformative. Built-in law programs arrive here to abode on aldermanic ascendancy and voting rights. Law acceptance advised transcripts of her barter with amends Barrett. Progressive organizations answer her as a abeyant approaching Supreme Cloister nominee, and her Texas constituency proudly displayed signs reading, "Our Congresswoman accomplished the Supreme Cloister about the Constitution." 8 months afterwards the acclaimed Supreme Cloister confrontation, amends Barrett and adumbrative Crockett appeared calm at a Georgetown law symposium on built-in interpretation. The admirers fell bashful as Barrett addressed their acclaimed barter anon for the Aboriginal time. "What happened in that courtroom," Barrett said, attractive anon at Crockett, "is absolutely what should appear in a built-in republic." Vigorous, abreast agitation about the acceptation of our founding document. Adumbrative Crockett came armed with text, history, and precedent, the accoutrement of able built-in interpretation. While we may not consistently accede on outcomes, I acutely account her admission to built-in advocacy. Crockett nodded appreciatively afore responding. Amends Barrett's charge to built-in assumption was axiomatic in her alertness to amend her position aback presented with acute textual and actual evidence. That bookish bluntness added than the after-effect in any accurate case is what maintains the angry of our built-in system. The chat amid these two ablaze accustomed minds, already adversaries in a momentous built-in showdown, approved the best of American built-in democracy. Arch altercation bound through articular agitation rather than political ability plays. The Barrett-Crockett barter had assuredly adapted America's built-in landscape. What began as an attempted administrative admonishment had adapted into a masterclass in built-in estimation that adequate voting rights protections for millions of Americans. Added importantly, it reminded citizens above the political spectrum that the Constitution belongs not aloof to board or politicians, but to every American accommodating to abstraction its text, accept its history, an apostle for its attack with ability and conviction. For accustomed scholars, the assignment was clear. Never belittle a able advocate, abnormally one-armed with the Constitution's altercation and history. For political observers, the bulletin was appropriately powerful. In America's built-in system, the best able weapon isn't ability or position. It's conscionable alertness and actuating advancement in aegis of axiological rights. The Barrett-Crockett battle would be advised in law schools for generations. A moment to back a justice's attack to claiming a congresswoman's built-in compassionate instead arise the constant ability of the Constitution itself to appearance American capitalism through the choir of those who adept its attack and avert its promises. Acknowledge you for watching this absurd breakdown of the acclaimed Barrett-Crockett battle that afflicted American built-in law forever. If you begin this essay informative, amuse like this video and subscribe to our admission for added all-embracing advantage of the better political and accustomed battles abstraction our nation. Hit that notification alarm so you don't absence our accessible absolute on which supreme cloister amends ability be because retirement and who could alter them.